On May 18, 1980, a mountain in Washington state exploded sideways. The blast was heard 1,200 miles away. It flattened 230 square miles of forest in under 3 minutes. One man was watching from 6 miles away. He had 6 words left. For 123 years, Mount St Helens did nothing. It sat in the Cascade Range of southwest Washington state, a near-perfect snow-covered volcanic cone so symmetrical that locals called it the Mount Fuji of America. Loggers worked its forests. Fishermen worked the rivers that ran from its slopes. A resort owner named Harry Truman had lived at Spirit Lake at the base of the mountain for over 50 years. He was 83 years old. He knew the mountain the way most people know their own backyard. When the evacuation orders came in the spring of 1980, he refused to leave. He told reporters he had lived here all his life, and the mountain was part of him. He said if the mountain was going to kill him, so be it. Then in March 1980, the mountain woke up. A swarm of small earthquakes began rattling the area. On March 27th, the first eruption in 123 years sent a plume of ash and steam into the sky. Small, almost gentle. The kind of eruption that draws curious tourists rather than serious evacuations. Scientists from the United States Geological Survey arrived to monitor it. What they found over the following weeks alarmed them far more than the ash. The north face of the mountain was bulging outward, visibly, measurably. By April, the bulge was growing at a rate of 5 feet per day. An entire side of a mountain swelling like a blister from within, pushed outward by rising magma that had nowhere to go. Nobody on Earth had ever recorded anything quite like it. David Johnston was 30 years old, a volcanologist with the USGS. He had studied eruptions in Alaska and understood better than almost anyone alive how unpredictable a waking volcano could be. He was stationed at an observation post 6 miles north of the summit, a ridge the USGS team had nicknamed Coldwater 2. It offered a clear line of sight to the bulging north face. It also placed him directly in the path of anything that might come off that face if it ever let go. Johnston knew the risk. For weeks, Johnston and his colleagues took turns at Coldwater 2, recording tilt measurements, gas readings, and the relentless daily growth of the bulge. Johnston had pushed hard for an expanded evacuation zone around the mountain, and largely succeeded, against enormous public and economic pressure from loggers and local residents who wanted their land and livelihoods back. His insistence on caution is credited with keeping the final death toll in the dozens rather than the thousands. On the night of May 17, Johnston was scheduled to swap shifts with a colleague, a geologist named Harry Glicken. Glicken needed the following morning free for a graduate school interview. Johnston, steady and reliable, took the post instead. It was meant to be one more ordinary night of data collection. At 8:32 a.m. on May 18, 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the volcano. The bulging north face, already destabilized by weeks of relentless swelling, could not withstand the shaking. In an instant, the entire face of the mountain detached and began to slide. What followed was the largest landslide in recorded human history. 2.9 cubic kilometers of rock, ice, and earth. Enough material to bury the entire city of Manhattan under 20 feet of debris. Broke away and began thundering down the mountainside at speeds approaching 150 miles per hour. But the landslide did something almost no one had anticipated. By stripping away the entire north face in an instant, it released the pressure that had been building inside the volcano for months, like pulling the cork from a bottle of champagne that had been shaken for weeks. What erupted was not a typical vertical eruption. It was a lateral blast, a sideways explosion of superheated gas, ash, and pulverized rock that tore outward from the newly exposed interior at speeds estimated between 300 and 670 miles per hour. It reached David Johnston's position at Coldwater 2 in under 90 seconds. He had just enough time to key his radio. "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Those were the last words anyone ever heard him say. His body was never found. His vehicle was never found. The observation post at Coldwater 2 was obliterated so completely that the ground itself looked different. Harry Glicken, the geologist whose shift Johnston had taken that morning, was in California for his graduate school interview when the mountain erupted. He survived. He spent the rest of his life studying volcanoes, drawn back to them despite everything, and died in the 1991 eruption of Mount St in Japan, 11 years after the mountain he had nearly been on when it killed his friend. Some mountains collect the people who love them. The lateral blast fanned outward across the landscape in a scorching near-instantaneous wave, flattening everything in its path for up to 17 miles from the summit. 230 square miles of old-growth forest, trees that had stood for centuries, were knocked flat under 3 minutes, all of them lying in the same direction. Others closer to the blast zone were instantly stripped of bark and branches and left standing as bare scorched poles. a phenomenon scientists would later call the Standing Dead. Spirit Lake, at the base of the mountain, was swept by a wave triggered by the landslide's entry into the water. A wave so powerful it stripped entire hillsides of timber and deposited a floating log mat on the lake's surface so thick and so dense that it remains there, partially. To this day, 45 years later, Harry Truman, the resort owner who had vowed to stay with his mountain, was buried under more than 150 feet of volcanic debris. He was never found. He would have wanted it that way. An ash column rose more than 80,000 feet into the atmosphere within minutes, 3 times the cruising altitude of a commercial aircraft, turning day into complete darkness across eastern Washington. In Spokane, more than 250 miles from the volcano, ash fell so thick at midday that streetlights came on automatically, triggered by the darkness sensors designed for night. The ash cloud drifted across the entire continental United States within 3 days and circled the entire globe within 2 weeks. 57 people died on May 18, 1980. Their average age was 44 years old. Most were in areas that even the expanded evacuation zone had not reached: loggers, campers, and people who had underestimated how far the mountain's violence could travel. 83 people survived within the blast zone because David Johnston had personally fought to push the boundary further out. When the ash settled, Mount St Helens was 1,300 feet shorter than it had been that morning. Where the near-perfect cone had stood for centuries, a horseshoe-shaped crater gaped open toward the north, exposing the mountain's interior to the sky for the first time in recorded human history. The United States government designated the area the Mount St Helens National Volcanic Monument in 1982, deliberately leaving the blast zone largely untouched so that scientists and the public could watch nature rebuild in real time. What followed surprised almost everyone. Life returned to the blast zone far faster and far more creatively than any scientist had predicted. Within weeks, insects arrived in the ash. Within months, fireweed and lupin were blooming in the gray volcanic landscape. Within years, elk had returned to graze on new vegetation. Within a decade, young forests had begun to reclaim slopes that researchers had assumed would remain barren for a generation. Spirit Lake came back to life. Its waters, though forever changed in chemistry and depth, are now home to fish once again, its shores to new growth. Thousands of bleached and silvered logs still float on the lake's surface, a permanent scar and a permanent reminder of the morning the mountain moved. In 1997, the United States Geological Survey opened a new observatory on the ridge where David Johnston died. It looks directly across the valley at the open crater, the same view Johnston had when the mountain came apart. They named it the Johnston Ridge Observatory. Mount St Helens erupted again between 2004 and 2008 in a series of smaller dome-building episodes, quietly growing a new lava dome inside the crater that is still there today. The mountain's still working, still breathing, still building toward whatever comes next. David Johnston's body was never recovered. There's no grave to visit. There's only a ridge, named for him, where on a clear day visitors stand at the observatory windows and look directly at the crater he was watching in the final 90 seconds of his life. He had spent his career arguing that volcanoes deserved more caution and more respect than most people gave them, that the only honest response to a system you cannot fully predict is humility, distance, and preparation. He gave the world those 90 seconds of warning with everything he had. 57 people died. Hundreds more survived because one man with a radio stayed at his post on a ridge and kept watching. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. 6 words, 90 seconds, and a mountain that the world is still learning from today.